Howdy, howdy. Welcome to MVI Gurukula. We have a goal of achieving 100 subscribers by May 1st. So click on the subscribe button below. The verse for this week is chapter 4, text 11. Being freed from attachment, fear, and anger, being fully absorbed in me, and taking refuge in me, many persons in the past became purified by knowledge of me, and thus they all attained transcendental love for me. There's a nice book by Viktor Frankl titled Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was interred in the death camps of Nazi Germany. He was a psychiatrist. He survived and he went on to continue to practice as a psychiatrist. And it was his observation that prisoners in the death camp who lost all hope, lost all meaning, they were the first to succumb to the atrocities of the Nazis. Now, this is not to victim blame. That's certainly not what he was doing, and of course neither am I. What the Nazis did was atrocious. So it's not to victim blame. What he had observed, and in his subsequent practice thereafter, and in his own experience, was that those who lost or were unable to maintain a sense of purpose, meaning, and hope, those were the first to succumb. Or the flip side of that is those who, in that situation, were able to maintain or find meaning in that situation, those persons had a greater chance of surviving, or at least having a better chance of lasting until the Allies came. That was his observation. And he writes about that in the book, Man's Search for Meaning. It is a brilliant book. I suggest you buy it, read it all the way through from cover to cover, because it provides a very powerful reminder and instructions on how to live a meaningful life as Vaishnavas, how to find meaning as Vaishnavas. It's a brilliant book. There's another book by Bonnie Ware. She was, or is, I assume she's still serving, I'm not quite sure, but she was a nurse for those who were at the end of life, last stage of life. And she was taking care of them and helping them pass on. And in taking care of them, she developed relationships, close relationships. She learned a lot about them, and she would have these discussions on some of their regrets in life. She compiled a book on the top 5 regrets. That's essentially the name of the book, The 5 Top Regrets of the Dying. Brilliant book as well. I suggest you buy it. The top regret of persons who were dying was that they did not live a life according to their own nature, essentially, but led a life to fulfill the expectations of others. That was the number 1 regret. Brilliant book. I also suggest you read it because for me it put into relief this idea, this principle of living a life of meaning based on Vaishnav principles, based on my relationship with Krishna. And the third book I'm going to recommend is the book by Simon Sinek, Start with Why. And he talks about how we go through life, engage in all time. It's a book on leadership. We go through life or engage in a particular career, and we climb the ladder of success. We know the example given by Stephen Covey, only to reach the top and realize it's leaning against the wrong wall. In other words, not finding, from the outset, meaning. Meaning and this verse are very closely related. In the first part of this verse, Krishna says, being freed from attachment, fear, and anger. That's the Jnani practicing Jnana Yoga. That is essentially Brahma Bhuta, coming to the realization of Brahman, free from attachment, fear, and anger. The second part of the verse, Krishna says, and taking refuge in me, gaining knowledge of me, they develop transcendental love for me. So Brahman realization is an important first step. It is a necessary first step, but it is not enough. Not for the Vaishnava who wants transcendental love for Krishna. For the Vaishnava, those of us who want transcendental love, for us there is taking refuge in Krishna. So the question becomes, we have this situation where being freed from attachment, fear, and anger, and taking refuge in Krishna, for the Jnani, that's a two-step process. They become free from attachment, fear, and anger, Brahman realization. Then, if they are lucky, because we know, as Krishna says, many, many thousands among men, one may endeavor for perfection. And of those who achieve perfection, who achieve Brahman realization, Krishna says, hardly one knows me in truth. Hardly one has transcendental love for me. So for Jnanis, this is a two-step proposition. First, coming to the level of Brahman, and if they're lucky, taking refuge of Krishna and developing transcendental love. For the Vaishnava, we do that in one step. It is a one-step proposition. Because if we ask and answer the question, how does one become free from attachment, fear, and anger? The answer is, Krishna gives it in the 18th chapter. Krishna gives the answer throughout the Bhagavad Gita, but the one I like the most and one I want to reference today comes in the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, text 58. Krishna says, Mat chitta sarva durgani mat prasada tarishrisi atat chet tamahankaranna sroshrisi vinangshisi. If you become conscious of me, Krishna says, you will cross over all obstacles of conditioned life by my grace. Conditioned life is attachment, fear, and anger. Conditioned life are the Arishad Dvargas, Kam, Krodh, Lobha, Moha, Mada, and Matsarya. These 6 enemies of the living entity. That's conditioned life. Krishna says, if you become conscious of me, you will cross over all obstacles of conditioned life, mat prasadat, by my grace. If, however, you do not act in such consciousness, but act through false ego, ahankara. Atat chet from ahankara. If we act through false ego, not hearing me, you will be lost. Ahankar. I, aham, do. Kar, I do. This idea that I'm in control. Many of the Gurukul students are learning Brahma Samhita. Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchidananda Vigraha Anadiradir Govinda Sarva Karana Karanam. Sarva Karana Karanam. Right? Krishna is the cause of all causes. We are not. We think ahankar, I am the cause of all causes. No. Krishna says that's an erroneous idea. If you act based on that idea, you will be lost. You will not cross over the obstacles of conditioned life. Kam, Krodh, Lobha, Moha, Mada, and Matsarya. But if you become conscious of me, you will. Very, very important point. If you become conscious of me, you will. To become free from attachment, fear, and anger, become conscious of Krishna, we will pass over them. Not only will we pass over them, we will automatically come to the stage where we will develop transcendental love for Krishna. We're already conscious of Krishna. We pass over all the obstacles and go to transcendental love for Krishna. It is a one-step proposition for the Vaishnava. But we must become conscious of Krishna. In the 2nd chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Dhyayato vishayan pumsa sangas teshu pajayate. While contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops attachment. From such attachment, lust. From lust, anger. From anger, delusion. From delusion, bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost. And when intelligence is lost, one falls down again into the material pool. Dhyayata. contemplating the objects of the senses, and there's a downward spiral of destruction. Dhyayata, thinking, contemplating the objects of the senses. Krishna says, Machitta sarva durgani. If you become conscious of me, there's an upward spiral towards Krishna. It all begins with our consciousness. And this really comes back to the books I was talking about when Viktor Frankl talks about meaning in his book Man's Search for Meaning. Bonnie Ware talks about the regrets of people who are dying when they think they did not live according to their truth, an inner truth, their personal truth. They lived and they chased other people's expectations of who and what they should do. And then Simon Sinek, who talks about start with why. It's essentially the English translation of Atato Brahma Jignasa, inquiring after the absolute truth. Why am I here? This inquiry into meaning, identifying our meaning, is the key. That is where our contemplation should be. As Vaishnavas, now we know. Jivera Surupoi Krishnera Nityadas. We are the eternal servants of Krishna. But that's easy. That's the philosophical principle. The problem is that we do not turn that into practice. Tomorrow morning, we have to get up, go to work at a job we do not like. Engage in activities we cannot connect with Krishna. 90% of our lived experience, 90% of our lived reality is separate from the idea of Jivera Surupoi Krishnera Nityadas. How do we reconcile the two? How do we bring 90% of our lived experience in connection with Jivera Surupoi Krishnera Nityadas? Where these two come together, that's where there's meaning. At that point, there is meaning. At that point, there is the answer to the question, starting with why. How do we do that, is the question. Simon Sinek gave an idea, which worked for me. And he gave the example of the English longbow, which for its time, medieval time, was a marvel of technological innovation in terms of warfare, the English longbow. And the English longbow requires that the draw is extraordinarily long, incredibly long draw for that bow to get distance and power and so on. And he uses that example that you have to draw as far back as possible to to identify meaning. The Vaishnava has to do the same. In my own life, I had to go back using his exercise in my own life, in my experience as a Vaishnava, and see in my life where Krishna guided me towards a certain path. Many incidences, experiences in my life had a common thread, a common theme throughout my entire remembered experience. Try it. Go back as far as you can in your life. And it takes some time. It's not something you can do in one sitting. It takes a deep meditation. This is the dhyayata, the contemplation. Looking in our life. From the very beginning we can remember. Whether we were devotees or not is irrelevant. Even when you were not devout, before you became a devotee, before you came to Vaishnavism. But as far back as you can remember, endeavor to identify Krishna's touch in where your life developed, various incidences. And you will begin to see a pattern taking shape. That pattern is Krishna's thumbprint on our life. That theme you begin to see through these events that you had no control over, events that you tried to avoid but happened anyway. When you begin to see those events in connection with Krishna, you begin to see a pattern. That pattern is meanings for our lives. When we act according to that pattern, when we recognize that pattern, identify that pattern, and live in accordance with that pattern, we bring our 95% of our lived experience with the principle, Jivera Surupoi Krishnera Nitya Das. Then that principle becomes a lived experience. The issue of how to become free from attachment, fear, and anger is irrelevant. Because we become conscious of Krishna, we've recognized Krishna's thumbprint in our life. Attachment, fear, and anger, that downward spiral of destruction, is irrelevant because we're experiencing upward spiral of growth towards Krishna, towards developing transcendental love for Krishna. Hari Hari.